At some point in the last decade, something quietly shifted. People started mentioning their therapist in conversation the same way they'd mention their dentist. Casually, openly, without lowering their voice. A millennial will tell you they're working through something in therapy before they'll tell you what they had for breakfast. And nobody bats an eye. But 30 years ago, that same sentence would have ended a dinner party. It would have made someone's mother uncomfortable for a week. It would have been filed under things you simply do not say out loud. So what happened? How did an entire generation take something that was considered private, shameful, and slightly suspicious and turn it into something as normal as going to the gym? The answer is not what most people think. And it starts long before anyone ever booked their first session.
To understand what millennials changed, you have to understand what they inherited. For the generations that came before them, the boomers, the silent generation, mental health was not a conversation. It was a closed door. Therapy was something you did if you were seriously, visibly, undeniably unwell. If you were having a breakdown, if you couldn't function. It was a last resort, not a first one. And even then, you kept it quiet. Because the cultural message was clear. Needing professional help with your emotions meant you were weak, that you couldn't handle your own life, that something was fundamentally wrong with you. This wasn't cruelty. It was the logical extension of a worldview that had been shaped by genuine hardship.
The silent generation survived the Depression and 2 world wars. They had developed a very particular philosophy about suffering. You endure it. You don't examine it. You don't pay someone to help you understand it. You get on with things. And they pass that philosophy down to their children and grandchildren as cultural DNA, which meant that by the time millennials were growing up, the stigma around therapy wasn't just a social preference. It was a deeply inherited belief about what strength actually looked like. Here's the strange part. Millennials were raised with more psychological awareness than any generation before them. They were told their feelings mattered. They were given participation trophies and after-school specials about self-esteem. Their parents, many of them boomers who had quietly suffered through their own unexamined pain, were determined to do better, to be more present, more emotionally available, more attentive to the inner lives of their children. And in many ways, they were. But there was a gap, a significant one, between being told your feelings matter and actually being shown what to do with them. Between being raised in an emotionally aware atmosphere and being given the actual tools to process difficulty, millennials were the first generation told that their inner world was important, and also the first generation to discover in early adulthood that nobody had actually taught them how to navigate it. They hit their 20s carrying more emotional self-awareness than their parents had, and less ability to manage it than they needed, which created something very specific. A generation of people who knew enough to know they were struggling, but didn't know how to stop. And then everything hit at once. Millennials entered adulthood during the 2008 financial crisis. The economy they had been promised, the one their education was supposed to unlock, collapsed. Jobs disappeared, student debt ballooned, the housing market slammed shut. The traditional milestones of adulthood that their parents had reached relatively smoothly, stable career, home, family, financial security, became genuinely difficult to achieve, and in some cases impossible. At the same time, social media arrived, and with it came an entirely new kind of psychological pressure. Constant comparison, constant visibility, the creeping awareness that everyone else appeared to be doing better, living more, managing more gracefully.
The gap between how your life actually felt and how everyone's life looked online became a source of low-level, chronic psychological pain that had no name and no obvious remedy. And this is the moment, this specific, overwhelming intersection of economic failure and social pressure and emotional isolation, where therapy stopped being a last resort and started being a survival tool. Not because millennials were weaker than previous generations, but because the particular combination of pressures they were navigating was genuinely new. And the old tools, endure it, push through, don't talk about it, simply were not sufficient.
But here's what makes this generation specifically interesting. It wasn't just that millennials started going to therapy. Plenty of people in previous generations had done that, quietly, privately, and without telling a soul. What was different was that millennials started talking about it. Publicly, openly, on social media, in group chats, at work, on first dates. And that shift, that specific decision to make private struggle visible, was not accidental. Think about it. This is the generation that grew up on the internet, that built their identities through digital self-expression, that learned earlier than any generation before them that sharing vulnerability could create connection rather than destroy it.
They had watched their parents carry things alone. They had seen what silent suffering produced in their own households, and they had made, largely unconsciously, a collective decision that the shame model wasn't working, that keeping everything inside hadn't protected anyone, that the stigma wasn't actually keeping people safe, it was keeping people isolated. So they started naming it, not as a radical act, just as the next honest thing to say. And in doing so, they quietly dismantled something that had been holding for generations.
The downstream effects of this are still unfolding, but some of them are already visible. Gen Z grew up watching millennials talk openly about mental health and absorbed it as completely normal, which is why Gen Z's relationship with therapy and emotional vocabulary makes even millennials look reserved by comparison. Workplaces that would never have acknowledged burnout a decade ago now have mental health days and employee assistance programs. The language of therapy, boundaries, triggers, emotional labor, attachment styles, has entered ordinary conversation so thoroughly that most people use it without realizing where it came from. And perhaps most significantly, the number of people actually seeking help has risen measurably. Not because mental illness increased, but because the shame barrier that had been keeping people from reaching out quietly came down. Most people don't realize that the normalization of therapy wasn't primarily a clinical achievement. It was a cultural one, driven not by institutions or governments or research papers, but by a generation of people who decided, largely by accident and out of genuine necessity, to stop pretending they were fine.
Go back to the beginning, that dinner party 30 years ago. The sentence nobody would say out loud, the uncomfortable silence, the thing carefully filed away. Now think about the person who grew up in that silence, who learned that their struggles were not for public consumption, who inherited the belief that needing help was something to be ashamed of. And then think about what it meant for their child, the millennial, to simply say out loud, I'm in therapy, and it's helping. Not heroically, not as a statement, just as a fact. That's the thing about cultural change. It almost never announces itself.
It happens in small, unremarkable moments. A sentence said at dinner, a caption posted online, a conversation that someone somewhere overhears and thinks quietly, maybe I could say that too. Millennials didn't set out to revolutionize mental health culture. They were just trying to survive, and they needed help, and they were honest about it. And that honesty, repeated millions of times across millions of conversations over the course of one generation, turned out to be one of the most genuinely useful things any generation has accidentally given the world.